Hello, everyone. Dan Weisskopf right in front. How you guys doing? Hope you had a very productive morning here at GTE. My name is Adam Patty. I'm the CEO of VistaShares. And today I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker. John McNeill is the co-founder of VistaShares. He's a visionary leader and a serial entrepreneur with a track record of founding and scaling 6 companies, resulting in tens of thousands of jobs and multi-billion-dollar returns for investors. Maybe you should turn the music off. Yes, thank you. John currently serves as the CEO and co-founder of the venture studio DVX Ventures. At DVX, John and his team have launched 12 companies that are attacking broad opportunities in large markets. Previously, John served as the president of Tesla, where revenue grew from $2 billion to $20 billion in just 30 months. Following Tesla, John joined Lyft as chief operating officer, where he played a pivotal role in doubling revenue and helping to take the company public. John currently holds an advisory partner position at Goodwater Capital and serves as the vice chairman of the board of directors for Cruise, which is General Motors' autonomous vehicle subsidiary. John is also a board member of General Motors, Asurion, CrossFit, Stash, and Lululemon. During his tenure on the board of Lululemon, the company underwent a turnaround, resulting in a quintupling of its stock value. John is a sought-after speaker and frequently lectures at Harvard Business School and MIT Sloan School of Management, and he's a graduate of Northwestern. So, thank you, John.
Thanks, Adam. Thank you. Oh, thanks. It's good to be with you today, and I'm excited to make this more of a conversation than a presentation. So I'm going to present some slides, and then we'll have some Q&A time as well. And I've been asked over the past year or so, every time something happens with Elon or the EV market, to come and talk about what's happening kind of in the broader markets. And oftentimes that subject will lend towards supercycles. And most of us as investors, you get a chance to see one supercycle in your lifetime, as like the Industrial Revolution or the Internet Revolution. Think about how many decades between those two, 12 decades. And now we're having an experience that is unlike any other in investment history, where we're seeing 4 supercycles converge really at the same time. We're seeing AI, electrification. Those two alone are combining to put pressure on grids, electrical grids in the Western Hemisphere, which we'll talk about. And then you've got robotics and biotech. And it doesn't take you too long to recognize that several of these are synergistically looped. And so they will accelerate each other as they gain further traction. So about a year ago, I was on CNBC, and Kernan, who loves to throw curveballs from the side, if you watch Squawk in the morning, he's constantly throwing me EV curveballs with some crazy stat that he pulls out of somewhere that I'm never prepared for it. But he turned with a serious question. He said, well, how does an investor invest in these supercycles? And I said, Joe, that's a good question. I would bet there's some ETFs that'll do that for you. And so I left the set, got in the car to head back over to our offices across town. And I started to look at the ETFs that were available in the AI and in the EV space. And the first ones I pulled up were the EV ETFs. And when I looked at their holdings, it shocked me. As Adam said, I played a senior role at Tesla. One of the things that happens when you're building stuff is you memorize what's called the bill of material. And the bill of material is every component that goes into your product. And so if you woke me up on a train or on a plane and said, what's the bill of material for an EV? I could recite that for you just because we had to live that every day. And so I could tell you what goes into an EV. 30% of the cost of an EV is the battery. So if you want to invest in the battery supply chain, you'd pull out names like LG, Samsung, ABB, and others. And that's 30% of the cost of what gets built. And then you'd go into the systems, the steering systems, the software systems, et cetera. And that's companies like Bosch. And similarly, if you go into an AI data center, which I'll cover some of these, you'd see a bill of material, what it costs to build an AI data center. One of the interesting things about that bill of material is that there's 10 times the fiber in an AI data center than in a regular data center. So an investor would really want to own Corning if you knew that. But when I opened up these thematic ETFs, what I saw was in the EV ETF, the top holdings were NVIDIA, Alibaba, Netflix, Apple, Google. And I had to do a double take. Am I looking at the S&P? Am I looking at the QQQ? Or am I looking at the EV ETF? And I was looking at the EV ETF. And no surprise to you, there's no Netflix in the bill of material for an EV. There's no Alibaba, but there's also no NVIDIA. We can't put a $25,000 chip in a car. And there's no Google, and there's no Microsoft, and there's no Apple. So the top holdings of the EV ETF have no representation of any on what you would want to have exposure to if you were an investor in the EV space. So I texted Kernan back and I said, don't follow my advice. EV ETF, AI ETFs are bad products. And he texted me back and said, what do you mean? And I told him what I just told you. And I got an OMG back. And so I started to think about, I was taking a trip that week and started to think, like, if I were going to build an AI infrastructure ETF or an EV ETF, how would I build it? And because I've been around Elon enough to know that you start to question every assumption, the first assumption in building an ETF is to build it by market cap. That's kind of a duh for everybody in this room. But I started to question that as a first principle. Market caps look backwards, not forwards. Market caps don't look at current dynamics because you typically have very large companies. Like in my example for EV batteries, LG, they make a lot more than EV batteries. So it's not necessarily immediately reflected in their market cap, their business in the EV space. So how would you build an index if you were starting from scratch with no preconceived notions? And so I called a friend and said, I have a crazy idea, but what if we built an index based on the bill of material? We can tell you with precision how many dollars are spent in an AI data center on cooling, on racking, on flooring, on fiber. And what if we gave investors an exposure to that? And my friend answered, well, BlackRock has a fund that does that, minimum investment $50 million per individual. I said, exactly, what if we could democratize this? So you could give the individual investor exposure to really sophisticated strategies that they could really only access if they were a super accredited investor through a hedge fund or through somebody like BlackRock's infrastructure fund. And so we started to build out these indices based on these bill of materials. Here's what goes into an AI data center. We built a lot of those at Tesla, believe it or not. Here's what goes into an EV. Here's what goes into robotics. And as we started to build the indices and backtest them, we could see that they blew away the thematics in those spaces. Of course, you're playing against Alibaba and Netflix. You're not playing against the real players. And then when I mentioned it to the president of GM in a board meeting, I sort of leaned over and said, what do you think of this? He said, makes total sense. The end producer in most markets makes a fraction of the profit pool. The supply chain makes a majority of the profit pool. And he said, in our business, in autos, the supply chain guys, they all have jets because they're making 40 to 50% gross margins while we're making 13. And I knew we were onto something. So I called Adam and we started to work on what we're now calling VistaShares. And that is to give you exposure to these supercycles. And so I'll give you, like, here is just a look inside of what an AI data center looks like. You've got not only semiconductors, like NVIDIA and TSMC, but you got flash memory, data protection, liquid cooling systems. And so we started to build out the index based on the dollar weighting of what it costs to build one of these AI data centers so that you give an investor exposure to the entire profit pool that doesn't begin with NVIDIA. And so what we wanted to do is, rather than looking at the past, as I mentioned with market caps, capture the horizon. And that is, look at the bill of material, look at the things that go into these. And we sort of played a little bit of an exercise with ourselves. We said, what if we could get back in the Wayback Machine and go back to 2008? And the iPhone has just been introduced. And we could introduce an iPhone fund. In that iPhone, you'd start to break down the components. And there'd be little companies that nobody had ever heard of, like Qualcomm, who was making the cellular radio. And some company that was making something called Gorilla Glass, which again was Corning. And we looked at, like, if you built the index up about what was built into that iPhone, would that have outperformed Apple stock over time? Want to guess what the answer is? Yes, it would have, because all those component companies were making greater margins than Apple. So you see these old line companies that tend to get buried in these kind of analyses like Corning. And this is today a transformative opportunity when you look at the billions of dollars created just with something that was invented and captured by Edison in the 1800s is now finally coming to roost. And that is the electrification of almost everything. But then AI, there was an important announcement this morning that I think a lot of you saw. A number of us will be getting iOS updates on our phones today. If you have an iPhone 14 or later. And that iOS update will include Siri plus GPT. So GPT, OpenAI, has 300 million users today. That's going to go up by a factor now that it's exposed in everybody's iPhone. And so these supercycles are beginning to take momentum, and they tend to happen much more rapidly than they have in the past because these are digital supercycles for the most part. So it's not going to take as long as it did in the Industrial Revolution, where you had to build factories and build infrastructure. These are digital. And so if you wait 3 or 4 years to get in as an investor, you may miss the cycle. And just think about how much market cap was created at OpenAI over the past 14 months. Their product was only introduced 19 months ago. And already $157 billion in market cap has been created. So if you want wait for a 3-year look back to get in, you're going to be way behind the curve in terms of what gets developed here. And a lot of the ETFs are offering kind of they're kind of copycats, and I'm preaching to the choir here. But they treat semiconductor buckets as all the same, and there are big differences between these semis in terms of how they participate in the AI revolution. Some of these are going down and backwards, and some of these will be going up. And one of the things that happens when you have an active ETF that's focused on the bill of materials, you capture those things. When lithium starts to get replaced by iron and batteries, you can make that move. But that move happens like that. It happens in 6 months. And so we think that looking deeper into these supercycles makes a lot of sense. In the AI case alone, you can see the shift from software as a service. The first went into cloud, and now is going into AI. And there's a massive shift in investment capital, in market capital that's going in. And you see that Moore's Law has marched ahead on the semiconductor side, and that's affecting NVIDIA particularly right now because everybody said, how do I play this? And that was the only name that a lot of advisors could come up with. But there's pin-up demand for these data centers, and that's where the NVIDIA chips go. And the NVIDIA chips, as you probably know, aren't chips. They're blades. They're computers. It's a $25,000 computer that gets plugged into a rack. And they've had to optimize those computers for throughput, which means the silicon is generating enormous amounts of heat because they want to get the throughput to market fast, and they've said to their engineers, we'll go optimize for heat later. So these data centers generate enormous amounts of heat compared to prior data centers. So liquid cooling is really important. Who makes the liquid cooling for these server racks? Any guess? Vertiv and HP. So HPE, this old line stock that people thought was going nowhere, actually is a critical player in this build out. And The absorption rates on construction are just absolutely amazing. And a lot of you have been reading about the second order effects and the third order effect. You build an AI data center, you generate a bunch of heat, you need a bunch of power to get to both power the chips and to cool. So that's led companies like Microsoft to say we're going to open 3 Mile Island. We need large, clean sources of fuel and electricity faster than the grid can respond. So we're really just in this in the beginning when you look at the AI infrastructure. There, of course, are AI data centers. And because the compute is so expensive and a bit constrained because of the power grid in the AI data centers, now the technology is moving to the edge. And so our iPhones and our cars are going to become key parts of the AI infrastructure. When Elon talks about on his earnings calls, the car will be the inference chip. He's literally saying that the car will be where the last decision tree is produced for the consumer on the chip in the car, not in the chip in the data center. It's going to become more distributed. And following that, AI applications will become more distributed, and then physical AI and drug discovery and robotics and things like that. So we're really just at the beginning of this super cycle, which is exciting. So I wanted to just introduce these concepts to you because I've got to now go back, as we've launched VistaShares last week, I get to go back and give Kernan the kudos for prompting a question that prompted us to think about this area of ETFs differently and think about super cycles and giving really democratization of access into these super cycles to regular investors. We will get these slides to you if you would like them, but if you want to grab them super quick, you can grab that QR code and it'll take you right to the slide deck as well, and you can download those slides. So that's why I wanted to kind of kick off a little bit of a lunch conversation and now see if you've got questions, we can do kind of a no-holds-barred Q&A. We'll be in this room under Chatham House rules, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. And to the extent that folks can't hear your question, I'll repeat it. How does that sound? Good. All right, sounds good. All right, got a question? All right, so the question is, when do we get real humanoid robots? And that goes back to, if I can take like a second to explain how the AI that we have works today. So the AI that we have today largely comes out of a framework that was discovered and invented by mistake. As most mistakes happen in a lab, AI definitely was one of these mistakes that happened in a lab. And it happened in a lab at DeepMind at Google. And they published this paper in 2014. So it's been about 10 years since this paper was released. And it was released on something called transformers. So what AI does today, the AGI that we have today, artificial generative intelligence, not general intelligence. What the Google researchers were doing was trying to do predictive modeling of language for translation. And they started to look at all the inputs that they could get, and they asked the computer to calculate the probability for, if I give you 2 words, what's the next word? If I give you 3 words, what comes after that? If you're a math geek, that is an optimization problem that's solved by linear algebra. And what they did was they created 64 layers of linear algebra to get the prediction model at its highest peak. And after 64 layers, it started to decline. And it still wasn't very good in 2014. If anybody have used the language translators, kind of janky what you got back. By mistake, one of the researchers one night ran it forward through the 64-layer model and then ran it backwards through the 64-layer model, and something magic happened. And that was the predictive power got an order of magnitude better. It got highly accurate. And the researcher described this as something, when we ran it backwards, forward and then backward through the model, it transformed the probabilities. And 10 years later, there's still no mathematical explanation of what happens in that reverse through. But that's why these models are called transformer models. So now you might get a sense of, like, the roundabout answer to this question. The AI that we use today, ChatGPT, Claude, Perplexity, et cetera, is really good at predicting what happens next in a sentence. That's what it's tuned to. And the more inputs you give it, 100 billion inputs, 500 billion inputs, a trillion inputs, it gets better. But there's an asymptote at how now much advancement it makes. So you're hearing people talk about scaling laws because the new models aren't getting better at the rate that the old models did. But all it does is predict the next word. It doesn't understand the physical world, meaning it doesn't understand physics. So if you go to use this stuff to drive a car today, really dangerous because it doesn't understand gravitational force, it doesn't understand what it means to run into something, et cetera. So we're trying to teach these models physics as fast as we can. What that means is for people that are really kind of into the problem, there are kind of three godfathers of AI. One of them is Jan LeCun, who runs AI at Meta. Jan says, when asked, like, when are we going to get human-level comprehension out of these systems? He said, people that ask that question don't understand the base of the technology that we have today. And that is, it can predict language, but it can't sit and do things with me interactively as a human yet, and probably won't be able to for a long time. And we see this as we train robots. So as Tesla trains its Optimus robot, if it's folding a shirt and the background changes, like the weather changes in the window, they have to go back and reprogram the whole thing, retrain the whole model. And there's just these limitations to these probabilistic models where the whole world is looking for what happens after transformers, what's next, because we realize that transformer models aren't sufficient to solve these kind of problems. So I don't know if that happens in 5 years. I don't know if it happens in 10 years. I don't know if it happens in 2 years. But we're a ways away, which is why on the AI day, the Optimus robots were sort of faked by humans in the background who are doing remote control because the tech just isn't there yet. And it bounces back and forth between a hardware constraint, like the hardware is not fast enough to make decisions, and then the software doesn't do enough. And so right now we're back on the software constraint where the software isn't smart enough yet.
Can I have a follow-up?
Yeah.
Knowing that, with respect to Elon Musk,
Right.
why does he do that? Like, create a facade around the technology?
Because he wants to create, like the way his brain works is it starts at the end. He said, here's the way I'm envisioning the world. And I'll work back from there. And I've got to convince at least 3 sets of people to go with me. I got to convince, first off, engineers to go with me. So I've got to paint a vision for something that is really meaningful to work on. So the last line of his recruiting, when he's trying to recruit an engineer, last line of his recruiting pitch is, do you want to go to Google and get people to click on more ads? Or do you want to come with me and save humanity? And he gets a different cohort of engineers. Second group he's trying to pitch are investors. Come join this vision. You know, the market cap of Tesla sort of is inexplicable without that vision. But that's the second group. And then third is then customers eventually to hop in and say, okay, I'll buy this car that somebody might be able to drive itself. I kind of believe in this vision. But that's who he's pitching to. And I think he honestly and earnestly believes that that is achievable. But he'll be the first to tell you his idea timelines isn't so accurate based on past performance, right? But that's why he does that. He does that to set the end goal and keep people's eyes on the end goal. Super simple, but that's what he's up to. Yeah, right here in the middle, yeah.
What, if any, do you think is needed around AI, and what does that look like in the future?
So there's what regulation is necessary. I think there's inputs regulation, which there's a lot happening right now, which is, if I'm going to go train a model on your IP, what can I do that? What do I owe you for that, et cetera? So it's really a rewriting of the copyright law. And creators and content owners are basically walling off their content until we can get this sorted out. And sometimes they're creating deals to say, here's the way I'm going to treat this IP, and that will probably become the precedent just through contract law. So it's on the input side. On the output side, it's really difficult. This is This is a very powerful technology for drug discovery, like when I meet with pharma, really biotech execs who are showing me that they can run 1,000 clinical trials in parallel, and how fast that speeds up the discovery process. There's a lot of good that can come out of these if we can find drugs to cure cancer and other diseases. But there's a lot of bad that can come out of this stuff too. And you can imagine nations using this to war with each other. And we're already seeing some of that just with the drones and the application of AI intelligence in drones in the Ukraine theater. So there does need to be some sort of framework. We have a nuclear regulatory framework, both in this country and internationally. And that's what some people, I really hope for, is that we're going to get countries to agree to this. But unfortunately, the cat's already kind of out of the bag, and countries are already using this maliciously and are probably loath to stop doing that. And but I think I watched this interview with the Palantir CEO that maybe a lot of you saw, where, over the course of the last week, he's saying that the top 5 AI companies are in the US, the second 5 companies are in the US, and the third 5 companies are in the US. So we have a real strategic opportunity from our tech sector, but we also have I think the regulators need to step in. The challenge is that those who set regulations in Congress are, to say it kindly, not up to speed at all with the tech and what it can do and what it can't do. Maybe with the exception of a handful of a few, but not, I think the supermajority barely know how to do a social post. But good question. Yeah, all the way in the back.
So in your 4 circles up there, one that I thought was missing, and I'm curious about what the thought is blockchain technology and how that interacts with those 4 circles.
Yeah, I think blockchain, separate from current crypto, blockchain has been a technology that's looking for it's a solution looking for a problem. And that's why it hasn't, literally tens of billions of dollars of investment have gone into blockchain with nothing to show for it. Because our ledgers kind of work today. And our ledgers are mostly automated. If I want to start a business, I can get QuickBooks up and running really quickly, and I have my own ledger. And the system around my suppliers for my payables and my receivables is a known one, and so the blockchain isn't really solving anything. And so that's why I don't think you've seen much on the blockchain side. There is, I think, an argument that obviously people are making on both sides is whether or not crypto is different, because crypto is a store of value. It's not a transactionable currency for the most part today. Like, we can't run down the street and pay for some Nashville hot chicken with our crypto. But you can transact in larger denominations, and you can store value. And so I'm empathetic to Powell's comments last week that this may be akin to gold. And then eventually you may be able to transact in it, but nobody's carrying around their gold bars and transacting. And I think that's what works in his analogy, is that it might not be a transaction source, and therefore not a threat to fiat, but it's looking like a tradable source of value, similar to gold. Yeah, but that's my point. That's kind of the only application that's been monetized. Yeah. I think blockchain is really cool, but again, it hasn't solved an economic problem for anyone other than crypto. Yeah. Yeah.
Which companies do you think will benefit the most from Elon's close relationship with Trump?
Oh, that's interesting. Oh.
Besides Tesla, even.
Yeah, I think SpaceX and Tesla obviously are what's behind a lot of the stuff that you're hearing already. So yeah, because I'm a board member at GM, I have to be careful. And Chatham House rules doesn't really suffice with the SEC. So I'll just say that like some of the moves that have been announced already are damaging to Tesla's US competitors and not to Tesla. So it advantages Tesla. So then you could look at, okay, who supplies SpaceX and Tesla? Well, they're vertically integrated, so not very many people other than raw material suppliers. Panasonic provides some batteries, CATL provides some batteries, Bosch provides some steering systems. But I think for the majority of the stuff that goes into a SpaceX rocket, it's vertically integrated at the factory in California. And it's an amazing factory to sit in because you basically watch raw material come in and really sophisticated CNC machines make all the parts of the rocket, including the engines. And so I think there's not an obvious investable opportunity around those companies. And then I'm just trying to think about what the second order question I would ask is, just out loud for myself, is what does deregulation mean? And then what does the shrinking of the US government mean in particular areas, and who would benefit from that? And I don't know those answers off the top of my head, but that's kind of where I would go next, is if I think members of both parties are excited about, like, this is a once in a generation chance to right size, or in the words of Brad Gerstner, help the US government get fit or more fit. And so what opportunities will that create for private industry? And I don't know enough about what they're going to go after first and what that might mean. I do know that, like, when I tried to fly into New York last week, the pilot got on the intercom and said, "Hey, I'm really sorry, but this is happening every day for 6 months. We're now in a hold, and we'll be in a hold for an hour." And that's because the FAA tried to get more employees. They were short-staffed. They tried to get more employees. They moved the New York Air Traffic Control Center to Philly. They lost a bunch of employees, and now there are 2-hour delays because they can't handle the planes. And so we'll get off our hold once we get a slot, because they can handle 50% of the air traffic into New York. Since Reagan, they've been trying to write software to do that. And it's pretty easy. You got a certain number of vectors in the sky, certain number of inputs, which are planes traveling at certain rates. And that's all, I mean, you talk about an AI problem, it could solve that in minutes, not even hours. You could write the software to do that. And so if they're successful at things like that, then you could look at, okay, who's going to provide the software to do that? It's probably Microsoft or Amazon. And so there are definitely, I think, some interesting ways to look at that dynamic if they're successful in getting this stuff through. But there's huge opportunities for it, and that's just one, obviously. Second is the way we file our taxes is like nothing in the industrialized world. That's all automated everywhere else, but here it's not. And there's just huge automation opportunities in the U.S. government, I think. And Palantir, I think, will be right in the middle of that stuff too. Yeah. Yeah, I discussed the need for power.
Well, like, how do you see that's going to shape out in terms of
Yeah.
sources? And then, there's been concern around, hyperscaler taking the power from and having these private agreements and, giving comments on how you think that's going to shape out.
All right, so two parts of the question. Comment on the increase in need for power, and second, will the hyperscalers step in and grab capacity for themselves at the expense of everybody else? Is that fair? Okay, so first off, I was really kind of like, I was asked this question, ironically on CNBC, what does this mean? So we went into the research, and it looks like between all the demands on the power grid right now, which are mainly driven by two things. Believe it or not, even though only 10% of new cars sold are EVs are driving huge draws on the power grid, and AI data centers are creating huge draws on the power grid. So if you look at what that trend looks like over the next 10 years, the power grid has to grow 4% every year. So when I did that research, I was like, 4%. Like, NVIDIA is growing 600%. Like, we can do this. And then I started to call around and ask CEOs of utilities, what does it mean to grow 4%? And what I got back was quite a different answer. And I knew this from my days in EVs, because when I would go to Europe or to Asia, one of the meetings we would always have is with the utility. And I didn't say plural. So we would meet with China Grid. We would meet with Korea Grid. We would meet with France Power. Because those countries have a single utility that is overseeing the growth and the maintenance of their entire grid and the growth of generation capacity and obviously distribution capacity. In the US, we have 1,600 utilities. That's really good from a national security standpoint. If you want to take down our grid, almost impossible. You got to take down 1,600 of them. It's going to be really hard. But if you want to increase capacity 4%, really hard. And it turns out the one thing that is the constraint, when you look at all the different parts of the grid, power lines, high voltage power lines, transmission centers, et cetera, the one constraint is the transformer that sits at the end of your block on a pole. That transformer has rare earth materials in it. It costs about $28,000. And there aren't very many factories that make those anymore. And so that's the constraint on the grid right now to growing the grid. And it's going to be really hard to get transformers replaced across 1,600 utilities fast enough. And obviously you don't have to do them all 1,600 because the demand in some areas of the country isn't the same as the demand on the coasts. And so the coastal demand is going to be where that action is. Now, can the hyperscalers in AI make that problem worse by stepping in and saying, hey, we're going to contract for power and take whatever capacity you can give us, Mr. or Miss Utility? And the answer there is they've already given up on that. So that's why you see them going to their own power sources. At the end of this state, if we got in the car and drove about 3 hours, we could go to the Tesla data center where the Dojo computer is. It's in Memphis. It's powered by dozens and dozens of gas turbine generators that were brought in because the Tennessee Valley Authority could not create the capacity for that single data center. So they just created it themselves. That's why Microsoft has gone to the 3 Mile Island folks and said, we'll pay to recommission that thing because we need all the power and we'll just build an open AI data center right there. And so I think the hyperscalers are going to end up adding to capacity, which will take pressure off of the grid. And that's one of the awesome things about the capitalist system is you've got this creative destruction and creation that happens with these cycles because investment dollars are flowing towards a solution. And the solution is grid doesn't happen fast enough. Therefore, we need alternatives. And so let's get really smart people thinking about alternatives and moving really fast. And we're already seeing that happen. So I don't think the second part of your question is an acute risk because they're just going to figure out small nuclear reactors, distributed nuclear reactors, et cetera. It's going to be the dawning or the redawning of nuclear in the US. Yeah, which means there are all kinds of companies that come up around that. The companies that handle the rods, handle the waste, do the transportation of those things. Like there's all kinds of companies that come up around that died in the US over the past couple of decades, but are still alive and well in Europe and in Asia because that's been a primary source of their power growth. Yeah. Yeah.
So you had a slide up that showed AI relative to earlier technological advancements.
Yeah.
Massive. And then you said, I believe it was the CEO of Palantir said the top 5 AI companies are in the US, the next top 5,
Yeah.
the next top 5.
Yeah.
So is the US on the verge of something like we have never seen before?
So the question is the US on the verge of something we've never seen before because this AI superstructure or cycle is so big? And the answer is yes. I think so. Like we're on the verge of unlocking a ton of productivity. We're on the verge of unlocking a ton of advancement, which creates IP. So if you've got biotechs creating new drugs, that creates IP for pharmas. And that stuff is happening right here, right now, basically in Cambridge, Mass, and Silicon Valley, and the Research Triangle. Those are the hotbeds for that. If you look at the robotics industry, that's kind of similar locales, Silicon Valley, Los Angeles / Orange County, and Cambridge, Mass. Like those are where you're watching enormous dollars pour in, and then to supply the chips that are going to go into all those compute stacks plus the end products, you see $100 billion coming into the Phoenix area alone to build fabs. So I think we're just starting to see this full-scale, full supply chain wave coming ashore. And it's really kind of, I think, the cool thing is with a lot of these, you know where the math is going to go. So this is not really, like if you take EVs, but just as an example of knowing where the math is going to go. So let's say you're an investor, you're my RIA, I give you a chunk of money and I say, make this grow 3x. Just in one example, like you'd be able to know how the math will go in EVs. So in November, 8.5% of the cars sold, new cars sold in the US are EVs. In November, 54% of the new cars sold in China are EVs. In November, 70% of new cars sold in Norway are EVs. Norway was the first country to adopt. China was the second. And when I talk about adopt, it's adopting a full-scale infrastructure, meaning you got chargers everywhere, and really bringing the incentive to the car buyer. And so you could say, gosh, even if incentives slow down on the buyer side because the economics of manufacturing have gotten better faster than we thought, you can sort of plot out what's probably going to happen in the US over the next couple of decades. And so you could, with confidence, turn to me and say, I think I could give you a 3 to 5x multiple on your money with one segment, because the math is pretty clear about how this super cycle is going to play out, because it's already played out on these same curves in other jurisdictions around the world with some differences. And maybe the biggest difference in the US is all those countries I named don't have an oil and gas industry to slow it down. And so in the US, we have an oil and gas industry that's trying like heck to slow this down. And so that's a big differential in the US versus other geographies. But consumers tend not to resist superior product. And during my last year at Tesla, the head of engineering at Audi got up and gave an all-hands update to the company, and he said, we have a major problem at Audi, and that is for anyone that owns an electric vehicle, they will never go back to gas because the experience is so much better. You hit the accelerator, the thing flies. You want to get into a spot on the interstate, you just punch it and it's there. Like the handling is so much better. The performance is better. The software is better. You don't have to go to a gas station anymore. He listed off all these things. And I think eventually that gravitational pull of the consumer wins. So I think with these super cycles, yeah, you can start to see, my gosh, there are enormous amount of supply chain investment opportunities, and that's what we're trying to capture for the Main Street investor. Yeah, you've had your hand up.
Think about green hydrogen as a fuel source potentially.
Green hydrogen as a fuel source has been really hard because when you put it into vehicles, you're essentially driving a hydrogen bomb. And most people don't like the security of that, security implications of that, so that's why it hasn't gone very far. The Japanese government really put a lot behind that because Japan doesn't have access to oil. They're completely dependent on all natural resources coming into that country. So they were like, well, we could make hydrogen out of the air. So let's put huge incentives to make hydrogen the primary fuel source. And it didn't work with the Japanese customer either, because it turns out it's super duper expensive to transport hydrogen to a place of distribution like a gas station or a hydrogen station. It's really expensive, way more expensive than gasoline itself. So it was economically unviable. Where it is viable is on trucking, because you can have big depots with big hydrogen capabilities, both production and storage. And so I don't think you're going to see electric semis, but I do think you're going to see a lot of hydrogen semis, because they're away from cities generally. You're not pulling a semi into Manhattan. Those are smaller trucks that go into the cities. So basically the way our distribution system works is semis take things a long way. They hit a depot outside of a major city, get broken down into smaller trucks, then go and deliver. And the mileage is all in those smaller trucks. So those are all being electrified. And you'll see the semis become more hydrogen fuel cell based, I think.
And then how about from a generation perspective, you had raised modular nuclear
It could be right now it's more expensive. Like we have got an abundance of natural gas here, so it's much more expensive than natural gas to do the generation piece. So yeah, maybe someday, but right now, given how abundant and cheap natural gas is here, it's probably not going to be competitive technology here. Yeah. So somebody comes to you with a hydrogen investment. Now you know. Yeah.
What do you think, or what do you advise Elon on making peace with the Democrats if things change at the midterms or in the next presidential?
Oh, this is fun. I get to be a political advisor now. Think about that for a second. So this is, listen, I was talking to our kids about this. The current situation is more a lesson, at least I told our kids, this is more a lesson for how you treat people. Because no matter how rich and powerful somebody is, their feelings can still get hurt. And grudge keepers, then their behavior can have massive implications. So my kids said, Dad, what do you mean by that? And I said, well, this all started with an EV summit at the White House in the first year of the Biden administration, and Elon gets snubbed. And that started a series of events from hurt feelings that went into resentment, that went into revenge. And it really doesn't have a lot to do with the Democratic Party as much as it does with the snubbing. And so I think there's going to need to be a reconciliation. When it comes back to parties, to maybe answer your question, my advice necessarily wouldn't be to, I would say, Elon, look for the olive branch, because somebody smart on that side of the aisle is going to want to extend an olive branch to make that wrong right, so that you can be constructive in dialogue with both sides of the aisle. But that's the root cause, I think, what we're seeing and why the behavior changed so dramatically between administrations. Because he literally went, this is public, I'll mention it. He literally went to the first meeting of the Trump Technology Council and came back and said, I want nothing to do with that. And removed himself and got back to work. And the change between that person and the person that we see today is dramatic, but it really started with the snubbing. So I told our kids, just be nice to people. Just be nice. And you may have an administration that really wants to court the unions, but you have to be balanced and give credit where credit's due. And although I don't agree with much of what he's done politically over the last 6 months, I will say that the EVs would not exist despite him, and the US wouldn't be in the #1 position in space without him. We don't have either of those technologies without him. And quite frankly, OpenAI started both of us had conference rooms, and there was a conference room in between us, and OpenAI started in that conference room in between us. And so a lot of what you see in artificial intelligence doesn't happen without him either. So I think both parties are much better off if he's being productive for society. So that'd be my short political advice, and then I'd hope that somebody else reached out with an olive branch on the other side. So it's a really good question. It's an important question. And so when I did my diligence on whether or not I should devote time to the General Motors board, my first piece of analysis was, are they serious about product? Because what Steve Jobs taught us, and what he taught Elon actually, is that best product wins. In fact, if you have a product that is unbelievably awesome, you don't have to advertise. So Apple really doesn't advertise. They don't have to, because their product is awesome. And we kind of take that for granted, but even in 2010 when the iPhone came out, it was so demonstrably better than flip phones that we all converted. And we converted so fast that the market caps of BlackBerry, Nokia, and Motorola didn't fall by half. They went to 0 within a year because the product's just awesome. And so he taught Elon that, and 99% of the hours we spent at Tesla were just make it better, make it better, make it better, make it better. And so when we introduced the Model 3 and finally got production working and got it out in the market, we were not satisfied with the driver's seat. Every week we come in and say the driver's seat sucks. Well, let's fix this baffle. Let's fix this angle. Let's fix this width. By month 8 of the Model 3 in production, we were on the 13th version of the driver's seat because we were dissatisfied. And the whole notion of that is make the product awesome and it will sell itself. So my first piece of diligence with GM was show me your product line and I want to meet your product people. And I got to see 2 years ago what you're now seeing. The first car I sat in was the Escalade IQ. GM has 66% market share in large trucks and SUVs. Think about Escalade, Suburban, Tahoe. They own that market on the gas side. I sat in the Escalade IQ, and I will tell you it is the most beautiful vehicle, electric or gas, I've ever sat in. It is beautiful outside, beautiful inside, the software is unbelievable, et cetera. I said, okay, show me the pickup, because that's your number 2 position. I went and sat in a Silverado EV that I've now been driving for 18 months. It's a 500-mile range, full-size pickup that doesn't have the short bed of a Rivian or a Cybertruck. It's actually a much better product. And so as I went through the product line, all the way down to the Equinox, which has just come out this month, I think this is public, but if not, you can wait 24 hours. It is on the fastest penetration curve of any EV ever. It's $34,000, 315 miles of range, more room than Model Y. It's an amazing car. So I went through the product and said, do these guys have a chance, and gals? And the answer was, they do. They've got really good engineering, and they can do something that the upstarts can't do. They know how to manufacture at volume. And so they made some really big strategic choices that I think are going to turn out right. They too wanted to vertically integrate into the battery supply chain. So they're making their own cells, making their own modules, making their own packs, which, because that's 30% of the BOM cost of the vehicle, building material cost, that's a really important advantage to have to control your own destiny on that stuff. Compare that and contrast that with Stellantis and Ford, just for the other big three. Stellantis is just in the game now with hybrids. But Sammy asked me this morning at breakfast, hey, aren't hybrids a big chunk of the market? And I said, not really. Out of the 8.5% of the new car market that's electric, 1% of that 8% is hybrid. The reason is you go in the lot, hybrid is more expensive than the EV because it has 2 drivetrains and it breaks twice as much. So Stellantis is on a path that is not a really great viable path. You read something different in the headlines because the headlines are driven by the oil and gas press. Ford decided to take their existing cars and just change out the drivetrain. And one of the things about electric cars is the battery really cares about how much the car weighs and how aerodynamic the car is. Because if you remember, for you physics geeks, velocity or resistance is velocity squared, meaning that the faster you go, the greater the resistance on the front of that thing. So if it's not sleek, you're burning tons of battery. And so Ford decided to change out battery trains, and their pickup comes out and it's got like 230 miles of range in a market where somebody else is coming out with a 500-mile product. And in Rivian's case, a 400-mile product. It just isn't viable. So I think there will be winners and losers based on product. And they will have a right to win because they've got manufacturing prowess that the upstarts don't have. And when we used to be, we literally were sleeping on the factory floor trying to fix Model X and then Model 3 and then Model Y issues. And we used to say, like, in joking, we would say, I bet Mary Barr is not sleeping on the factory floor tonight. Because she didn't have to, because they knew how to make stuff. And we didn't know how to make stuff. There's been a lot of advancement at Tesla since then, but they're still not as good at making stuff. So I do think there will be some automotive manufacturers that make it through this gauntlet and a lot that don't. But it's all going to be based on how cool the product is and how attractive it is. And then eventually where the puck's going is it autonomous? Because much like the smartphone to flip phone to the smartphone, if you wake up one day and for tens of thousands of dollars, you can get a car that is now your chauffeur, you get 11 hours of week time back commuting, and you get the convenience of the car takes your kids to school, drops them off, goes and picks up breakfast, brings it back, takes you to work. That's a game changer, and so that That's the real question, is who's going to win on autonomy? And again, I like GM's position there because they've owned Cruise and they're now embedding a lot of that product into their vehicles, and they're logging 10 million miles a month on Super Cruise in their own cars today. So that's how I'd answer the question, with public information that's available to you as an investor. How's that sound? But that's how I'd thought about joining the GM board. Like, do these chance at winning? Yeah. So I think you're asking two questions. One is on the price to the consumer, which is really a cost question of production. And then second is what happens to infrastructure?
Yeah, and how much government involvement do we need in terms of subsidies and tax incentives to really get us where we need to get to?
Yeah. So I think like if the incentives go away, what happens? I will tell you, at GM, we started to look not at the incentive going away, we looked at somewhere else. We said, what if the Chinese manufacturers can come here? What has to be true for us not to get annihilated, in Elon's words, by that? And so we started to work on low-cost manufacturing, vertical integration, all the things you'd work on. And that's what produces that $34,000 Equinox EV with all those features at that price point. So we're already below Tesla. And we can produce a car there. And that's before the Bolt comes out in a few months, and that's going to be even a lower price point. So we had to get to a lower cost basis. And when we do that, then you can help the market absorb the lack of a federal incentive to buy the car. Because the whole reason those incentives exist were to encourage the market to come in, because a gas car and an EV are at the same price parity. We're now getting to price parity because we've worked on the cost. So that's an issue that I think will continue to play out, but it's why, look, I don't lose a lot of sleep at night, at least for GM, when Elon says, I'm going to pull the rope up after I've taken advantage of tens of billions of dollars in subsidies, and now nobody else gets them, because we're in a different place than we would have been 5 years ago. On the infrastructure, that's a huge issue in the US. As Scott was saying this morning, like, you go to London and there is a plug-in on every corner, every light post. You go to Paris, it's the same thing. Like, we have not done those things here in the US yet. And that really is because of our system. It's not a national system, it's a state and local system on permitting. And so we got, for all the work that's going to be done on government and regulation at the federal level, there's state and local level stuff that has to get done that basically cleans up our permitting process so people can put infrastructure in without 4-year projects, because that's what it is today. It's terrible. And so I think there's a lot of work to do on the infrastructure side, for sure, to catch up. You need one charger for every 12 EVs that are on the road. And we have that today, but we may not have that as EVs continue to grow. Yeah.
Autonomous driving and auto insurance. It seems like, that's going to go hand in hand.
Yeah.
And so if the auto manufacturers need an incentive, there's your incentive right there.
Okay, so this is a really good point. So he asked about the relationship between autonomous driving and auto insurers. And I gave a talk at the Boston Economic Club a few weeks ago, and the people who sit at a Boston Economic Club luncheon are all the portfolio managers at Fidelity, Wellington, et cetera. And so one portfolio manager came up at the end. He said, should I be buying long-term puts on Progressive and Allstate, et cetera? And I said, yeah, because those companies' revenues are a function of accidents happening. As accidents decrease by orders of magnitude, maybe to close to zero, there's nothing left to insure. Therefore, I think you're going to have a hard time 10 years from now as an auto insurer. And of course, that decline is going to happen slowly at first and then all of a sudden. But once it starts to happen and you see the decrease in accident rates, the long tail of those cash flows is going to be knowable to investors, and you're going to see those values crash. So I think you're asking a super wise question, like what happens? I would look for, like, if somebody gave me the over-the-counter 10-year put on some of these auto insurers, I would either write calls or buy puts. because it's inevitable. And in cities in China, they're again ahead of us on autonomy. Wuhan was the first city that they released autonomous. Two important dynamics happened in Wuhan. One is accident rates declined precipitously. The second is that people stopped taking human-based rideshare because and this is already happening in San Francisco with Waymo, the experience is so much more superior without a human-based driver. And so there was a study that somebody published on that midsummer, and you saw Uber stock go whoosh, because there's likely a big impact on rideshare first and then auto insurance second, based on what we've already seen happen in China. So I've got to keep you guys on schedule. I've just gotten the news, so thank you very much. I hope this was an interesting lunch discussion.